Well, I feel like I should start with a warning. This presentation may involve unpleasant truths. It may involve disturbing arithmetic, and it may even involve some un-Canadian thoughts. So in other words, if you were hoping for a feel-good, uplifting talk, you might want to check your phone for the next 12 minutes. The other thing you need to know is that I am not a healthcare professional. I don't even know very much about healthcare. What I am is I'm a macroeconomist. And what that means is that macroeconomists, we think about the very big picture, and then we make some heroic assumptions to help us project what the future might look like. So with those warnings, how are millennials going to pay for the health care of aging boomers? The short answer is they won't. They're not going to be able to, at least not the way we currently deliver health care. And if that's all you needed, you can go back to your phone. I will try to unpack that a little bit for you. So let's break this question down. How are millennials going to pay for the health care of aging baby boomers? So there's two bits to that. First of all, how much money are the millennials going to have, and how much is health care going to cost? So how much money are the millennials going to have? I want you to picture a pie. That pie is the economy. The faster the economy grows, the bigger the pie gets, the more pie there is for everybody. Now, over the last 40 years, the economy has grown on average at about 3% if you adjust for inflation. So that means every year, on average, the pie gets 3% bigger. Growth comes from two sources. It comes from labor force growth, more workers, and productivity growth, more output per worker. So over the last 40 years, labor force growth has averaged about 1.5%. So the economy's growing at 3%, so roughly half that growth has come from more workers in the economy. The other half has come from improvements in labor productivity, more output per worker, and that's related to improvements in technology and improvements in how we organize production and distribution. So, okay, what about the next 25 years? Well, of course, that's a tougher question, but let's look at these two sources. Start with labor force growth. So what we've seen in the last several years is that the baby boomer generation, which has a lot of people in it, is starting to retire. So there are a lot of people leaving the labor force. And as a result, labor force growth has fallen. It was going at about 1.5%. It's now actually a little under 1%. And if you just roll those demographics forward, it looks like it's going to go down to about 0.5%. So we used to be getting 1.5% from labor force growth. We're going to get 0.5%. Now, if productivity growth were to accelerate, we could fill in that growth hole. But actually, sad news, productivity growth has also slowed. It was running at about 1.5%. In the last 10 years, it's averaged just under 1. So what does this mean going forward? Well, what it looks like is something like 1.5% growth is probably about as good as it gets. So yeah, the pie is going to be growing going forward, but it's going to be growing a lot less than what we're used to. Okay, so what about healthcare costs? So picture the pie again. There's a slice of that pie. The slice of that pie is healthcare costs. And healthcare costs are about 11% of the economy. So if you think of a pie, it's sort of like the slice is kind of like 1/8 of the pie is healthcare costs. Healthcare costs have been growing faster than the economy, so that share of the pie has been going up. And one way to see that quite clearly is if you look at, for example, Ontario's Ontario's budget. The share going to healthcare 40 years ago was about 30%. Today, it's a little over 40%. So what about the next 25 years? Now, what we know about healthcare costs is that they go up when we get older. On average, the healthcare cost for an 80-year-old is $20,000 a year in Ontario. The healthcare cost for an average Ontario citizen is $4,000 a year. So in other words, an 80-year-old on average is 5 times more expensive than the average Ontarian. And looking ahead, we're going to have a lot of baby boomers that are aging. And one way to see that is something we call the old age dependency ratio. So on the numerator, you've got Population 65 and over, denominator, what we call the working age population, 25 to 64. In 1980, that ratio was 20%. So 20% over 65 relative to working age. From 1980 to 2010, it went up very gradually from 20 to 25%. But since 2010, which is when the baby boomers started to retire, it started to shoot up quickly. Today, 5 years later, or 6 years later, it's already 30%. And every 5 years, basically, it's going to go up about another 5 percentage points. So by 2035, only 20 years from now, it's going to be 50%. So in other words, in the space of 25 years, we would have gone from this ratio of 25% to 50%. The inescapable implication is that the growth of this slice of the pie that's healthcare is going to accelerate. So, millennials, here's the thing. You're going to be working. Us baby boomers, we're going to be retired. Most of that healthcare spending is going to be to look after us. For the millennials, you're going to be working. You've got to generate the whole pie, but the pie is going to be growing more slowly, and the share that's going to us in healthcare is going to be getting bigger and bigger. So basically, the bottom line is you're not going to get to enjoy very much of the benefits of all this work you're doing. And at some point, you're going to say, I'm not going to take this anymore. And that, I'm afraid, is the unpleasant truth and the disturbing arithmetic. So what are we going to do? Now, economists are not very good at predicting the timing of when things are going to change, but when something is unsustainable, it won't be sustained. Something will change. And I actually am, despite this talk, really quite an optimistic person. Canadians are very inventive. They're very resourceful. We're a very pragmatic country, and faced with a serious challenge, we will change. In fact, we've done this many times through our history. And I'm confident we will do it again. Necessity is the mother of invention. So what are we going to do? Well, there are two bits to this. We've got to grow the pie faster, so there's more pie for everybody. And we've got to do a better job of managing the growth of healthcare costs so that the slice going to healthcare doesn't grow too fast. So how do you grow the economy more quickly? That's a big question for the 1 minute I'm going to devote to it. But very quickly, the solution is not more monetary stimulus or more fiscal priming. And we can't really do very much about labor force growth. We could have more immigration. That might be a good idea. We could have people work longer, retire later. That's probably a good idea too. But there's basically no way we're going to get back to 1.5% labor force growth. So really what we need to do is we need to focus on productivity growth. This country needs a productivity agenda, and it should have 4 key pillars: innovation, talent, trade, and infrastructure. Okay, that's it for the economy. What about healthcare costs? Here's where I'm afraid the un-Canadian thoughts are going to come in. We need 2 parallel tracks. The first is we need to have an adult conversation in this country about the role of the private sector in healthcare. Now, we tend to compare ourselves to the United States. And when you compare the Canadian healthcare system to the US system, the Canadian system looks fabulous. It delivers better healthcare outcomes, it's more efficient, and it's more equitable. And Canadians are justifiably proud that we're beating the Americans on this front. But when we compare ourselves to a broader set of countries, actually there is much less to be proud about our healthcare system. Countries like the UK, the Netherlands, Australia, Germany, New Zealand, they're ranked ahead of Canada on efficiency, on healthcare outcomes, and on equity. And one of the things that all those healthcare systems have in common is that they have allowed some role for private sector competition with the public healthcare system. We need to set aside our sacred cows and have an evidence-based discussion about how to best deliver healthcare in this country. Let's not define ourselves as Canadians on how we deliver healthcare, let's define ourselves as being very healthy. That's a big question. It's a big discussion. It's going to be, even if we start tonight, it's going to be a big debate in Canada, and it will take some time, and it should take some time. So, but we don't have much time. The baby boomers have already been retiring for 5 years. So that's why we need a second track. And the second track, we can start right away. In fact, it has already started, and that is to introduce more market forces within a public system. So what does that mean? And I'm just going to offer you a couple of examples. So rather than funding hospitals based on the historical funding levels, supposing we funded them based on results. So the hospitals that are delivering better quality health care for less cost, more efficiently, they get more money. The hospitals that are delivering less good health care outcomes at higher costs, they get less money. Now, what would that do? Well, that would create competition between hospitals to improve the quality of health care and at the same time drive more efficient delivery of health care. Now, I know competition between hospitals, it's un-Canadian. Bundled reimbursement. Rather than the province paying, let's say you need a hip replacement. So what happens? So the province pays the surgeon, they pay the OR, they pay for the post-operative care, they pay for the physio, etc. Supposing instead of paying each bit piecemeal, they paid one entity. They paid the hospital, and they paid it a fixed amount based on outcomes, speed of recovery, absence of complications, etc. And then the hospital worked with their system and with their partners to deliver that. Well, what would that do? Well, that would actually create the incentive for the hospital to figure out a more efficient way to deliver the hip replacement and all the bits of care. And it would also provide an incentive to improve the quality of care. So, now that, of course, requires more, bigger. So the good news is that is actually starting, but it's moving very slowly. And it's got to move more quickly. And one of the key pieces of that is we need more measurement of healthcare outcomes. So my message to those of you who are millennials is you can't afford to pay for the healthcare of us aging baby boomers unless there are dramatic changes in the way we deliver healthcare. Technology, good news is, I didn't talk much about this, but technology is something that could be very helpful. But technology by itself is not going to be enough. We have to pay more attention to the incentives in the system, who pays and how we pay. I'm actually very confident if we put our minds to this, we can solve this problem. The first step is self-awareness, and I hope I have at least improved that. Thank you.